She had learned, somewhere between 70 and 82, that silence could be the loudest form of love. Helen Morrison sat at her kitchen table every Tuesday morning at 9 o'clock with a cup of Earl Grey tea and a pen that belonged to her late husband. The pen was nothing special, a standard ballpoint with a pharmaceutical company logo from 30 years ago, but it still wrote smoothly, and that felt important somehow, like continuity, like Robert was still there, helping her find the right words. The kitchen faced west, catching afternoon sun but remaining cool and shadowed in the mornings. Helen preferred it that way. Mornings were for clarity, not warmth. The table was old oak, scarred from decades of use, knife marks from hasty meal prep, water rings from forgotten glasses, a dark spot where her youngest grandson had once spilled grape juice and she'd been too slow with the paper towels. This particular Tuesday in early November, the fog pressed against the windows of her small house in Seattle, blurring the neighbor's fence into suggestion rather than certainty. Helen had set out her stationery, cream-colored paper, unlined, simple, and was considering what to write. She'd been writing letters every Tuesday for the past 6 months, always on Tuesday, always at 9 in the morning, always with Robert's pen. The letters went to her daughter, Claire, who lived 40 minutes away in Bellevue with her husband and 2 teenage sons. Claire received them every Thursday. The mail was reliable that way, and had never once responded. Not a phone call, not a text, not a letter in return. Just silence. Helen took a sip of her tea. It had cooled to exactly the temperature she preferred, warm enough to comfort, cool enough to drink without caution. She set the cup down carefully, leaving no new ring on the table, and picked up the pen. "Dear Claire," she began. The estrangement had happened gradually, the way these things usually did. No single fight, no dramatic falling out, just a slow accumulation of distance that hardened into something that resembled permanence. It had started, Helen thought, around 3 years ago, maybe 4. Claire had begun calling less frequently. Visits became shorter, more perfunctory. Family dinners developed a strained quality, everyone working too hard to be pleasant, which paradoxically made everything feel more tense. Helen had tried, at first, to address it directly. She'd asked Claire if something was wrong, if she'd done something to offend, if there was anything they needed to talk about. Claire had smiled that tight, professional smile she used with difficult clients at her law firm and said everything was fine, just busy. Work was demanding. The boys had activities. Life was full. Nothing personal. But it was personal. Helen knew the difference between actual busyness and intentional distance. She'd lived long enough to recognize all the varieties of withdrawal. The invitations to family events became less frequent, then stopped altogether. Birthdays passed with cards sent by mail rather than visits. Holidays were celebrated separately with vague promises about getting together soon that never materialized. Helen's 2 sons, who lived out of state, noticed the shift. They'd asked her about it during their own calls home. She'd deflected, made excuses, protected Claire's privacy the way mothers do even when their children are well into their 40s. But the silence had hurt. It still hurt. A quiet, persistent ache that had taken up residence somewhere in their chest and refused to leave. 6 months ago, Helen had decided to do something about it. Not to fix it, she was old enough to know that you couldn't force reconciliation, but to maintain connection in the only way Claire seemed willing to accept, one-sided though it was. She'd started writing letters. The first letter had been the hardest. Helen had sat at this same table with the same tea and the same pen and stared at blank paper for 20 minutes before managing to write anything. What did you say to someone who'd stopped wanting to hear from you? How do you reach across a silence you didn't understand? In the end, she'd kept it simple. She'd written about the weather, about her garden, which was entering its autumn dormancy, about a book she was reading, about a recipe she'd tried that hadn't turned out quite right. Small things, safe things, the kind of minutia that wouldn't demand a response or carry any implicit criticism. She'd signed it Love, Mom, and mailed it before she could second-guess herself. The following Tuesday, she'd written another one, and then another, week after week, building a one-sided correspondence that Claire never acknowledged, but also never refused. Helen had no idea if Claire even read the letters, but she kept writing them anyway, because the alternative was letting the silence become absolute. And Helen had learned over 80 decades of living that absolute silence between people who loved each other was a kind of death, slow and quiet, but final nonetheless. Today's letter posed a particular challenge. Thanksgiving was in 3 weeks, and Helen needed to decide whether to mention it, whether to invite Claire and her family, knowing the invitation would likely be ignored, whether maintaining hope was an act of faith or an act of denial. She set down Robert's pen and looked out the window. The fog was lifting slightly, revealing the skeletal branches of the cherry tree in her backyard. It had been Robert's favorite. He'd planted it the year they bought this house, 47 years ago. It bloomed spectacularly every spring and bore small tart cherries every summer that Helen turned into jam. Robert had been dead for 5 years now. Heart attack, sudden. One moment he was reading the newspaper at this table, the next he was on the floor, and Helen was calling 911 with shaking hands and a voice that she didn't recognize as her own. She still missed him with an intensity that sometimes surprised her. People said grief faded with time, and in some ways it did. The edges dulled, the constant ache became intermittent, but the missing, the fundamental absence of him, that never really changed. If Robert were here, he'd know what to say to Claire. He had a gift for navigating the complicated emotional terrain of their children. Helen had always been more direct, more likely to speak uncomfortable truths. Robert had been the diplomat, the bridge builder, the one who could say difficult things in ways that felt like kindness rather than criticism. But Robert wasn't here, and Helen had to figure this out herself. She picked up the pen again. Dear Claire, the cherry tree is nearly bare now, just a few stubborn leaves clinging to the highest branches, refusing to acknowledge that winter is coming. I suppose we all do that sometimes, hold on to things past their season. I've been thinking about Thanksgiving. I'm planning to cook a small turkey this year, just for myself, unless any of your brothers manage to visit, which seems unlikely given the distance. There will be stuffing, of course, and that cranberry sauce you used to love when you were little, the one with orange zest. I still make it every year out of habit. You and your family would be more than welcome to join me. No pressure. I know you're busy, but the invitation stands, as it always does. I saw a cardinal yesterday in the backyard, bright red against all that gray. It made me think of you, the way you used to insist on wearing your red coat every day in kindergarten, even when it was too warm for a coat. You said red was a brave color. I think you were right about that. The book I'm reading is quite good, a mystery set in Scotland. I'll tell you about it next week. Love, Mom. Helen read it over once, folded it carefully, and slid it into an envelope. She addressed it in her neat, old-fashioned handwriting, the kind they'd taught in schools when penmanship still mattered, and set it aside to mail later. Then she sat with her cooling tea and wondered, not for the first time, what exactly had gone wrong. Helen had 3 theories about the estrangement. She'd turned them over in her mind countless times, examining them from different angles, trying to determine which felt most true. Theory 1, she'd been too critical when Claire was growing up, too exacting, too focused on achievement and propriety and doing things the right way. Claire had been a sensitive child, easily wounded by perceived disapproval. Maybe those old wounds had finally festered into something that required distance to manage. Theory 2, Claire resented the way Helen handled Robert's death. Helen had been stoic at the funeral, dry-eyed and composed, managing logistics and comforting others while appearing untouched herself. It was only later, alone in this house, that she'd fallen apart. Maybe Claire had interpreted Helen's public composure as coldness. Maybe she'd needed to see her mother break down and felt abandoned when Helen remained intact. Theory 3. This had nothing to do with Helen at all. Claire was navigating her own midlife challenges, career stress, marriage strain, teenage sons, aging parents. Sometimes people withdraw not because of what you'd done, but because they simply didn't have capacity for more connection. Maybe Helen was collateral damage in Claire's process of survival. The truth was probably some combination of all three, plus factors Helen couldn't see because she was too close to the situation. But knowing that didn't make the silence easier to bear. Helen had been a nurse for 42 years before retiring. She'd worked in pediatrics, which suited her temperament. Practical, calm under pressure, good at reading nonverbal cues. Children couldn't always articulate what was wrong, so you had to observe, notice, pay attention to what wasn't being said. Those skills had served her well in parenting, too. She'd been good at reading her children's moods, anticipating their needs, providing structure and care. But somewhere along the way, something had shifted with Claire. The signals had become harder to read, the needs more opaque, and Helen, who prided herself on attentiveness, had somehow missed the moment when her daughter had stopped letting her in. It was Robert who first noticed Claire pulling away. He'd mentioned it over dinner one night, maybe 4 years ago. Said Claire seemed distant, distracted, like she was there physically but not emotionally. Helen had brushed it off. Claire was busy, under stress. It was a phase. But Robert had been right, and by the time Helen recognized the pattern, the distance had already calcified into something much harder to bridge. The Tuesday letters continued through November. Helen wrote about the weather turning colder, about preparing the garden for winter, about a documentary she'd watched about monarch butterflies, about nothing and everything in that careful way you communicate with someone who might not be listening, but you hope is anyway. Thanksgiving came and went. Helen cooked her small turkey and ate it alone, packaging the leftovers into single-serving containers that would sustain her through the following week. The cranberry sauce with orange zest sat untouched in the refrigerator. She'd made it anyway. Hope or habit, she wasn't sure which. Claire didn't call on Thanksgiving, didn't respond to the invitation. The silence held. Helen wrote her Tuesday letter as usual. Dear Claire, Thanksgiving was quiet this year. I had the house to myself, which meant I could watch whatever I wanted on television and eat dinner at whatever hour suited me. There's a particular freedom in solitude, though I confess I'd trade it for company if company were available. I've been thinking about the year you were 8 and insisted on making the entire Thanksgiving meal yourself. You were so determined, so sure you could handle it. I let you try, supervised of course, and you made the most extraordinary mess. Flour everywhere, a turkey that was somehow both burnt and raw, mashed potatoes that had the consistency of glue. But you were so proud of that meal, and we ate it anyway, every terrible bite, because effort matters more than outcome. I think you understood that even then. You've always been someone who tries, who commits, who doesn't do things halfway. I admire that about you. I always have. Love, Mom. She mailed the letter and tried not to calculate how many she'd sent without response. Numbers made the silence feel heavier somehow. December arrived with its reliable complications. The holidays demanded decisions: where to spend them, who to see, how to navigate family obligations. Helen's older son called from Arizona to say he and his family will be skiing in Colorado for Christmas. Her younger son called from North Carolina to say his in-laws were hosting this year and he couldn't travel twice, which left Helen alone for Christmas unless Claire decided to bridge the silence. Helen prepared herself for solitude. She could handle it. She'd handled worse. But there was a particular loneliness to being alone during holidays explicitly designed for togetherness, a loneliness that felt less like peaceful solitude and more like evidence of failure. She decorated anyway. Not extensively. She wasn't going to pretend enthusiasm she didn't feel, but enough to mark the season: a small tree in the living room, lights along the front porch, Robert's favorite ornaments hung in their familiar positions. And she kept writing her Tuesday letters. Dear Claire, I'm decorating the house for Christmas. Just the basics this year. The tree is up, though it looks a bit sparse. I'm not as good at decorating as your father was. He had an eye for balance that I've never quite managed. Do you remember the year he strung lights along the entire roof line and half of them didn't work? He spent 2 days troubleshooting, replacing bulbs one by one, absolutely determined to make them all light up. When he finally got them working, it was Christmas Eve. We stood in the driveway together, all 5 of us, looking up at that ridiculous display of stubbornness and dedication. You said it looked like our house was smiling. I think about that sometimes, about how the simplest observations from children can capture something profound that adults miss. I hope you and your family have a lovely Christmas. Whatever you're doing, wherever you are, I hope. Christmas Eve arrived cold and clear. Helen had accepted an invitation from her neighbor, Joan, to attend a candlelight service at the local church. Joan was a widow, too. Her husband had died 7 years ago, and they'd developed a quiet friendship built on shared loss and proximity. The service was beautiful. Traditional carols, candles held in darkness, a homily about light and hope and the radical act of showing up for each other. Helen let the music wash over her and tried not to think about Claire sitting in some other church 40 minutes away, surrounded by her family, not thinking about her mother at all. After the service, Joan invited Helen over for cookies and tea. They sat in Joan's warm kitchen, so similar to Helen's own, but filled with Joan's things, Joan's memories, Joan's particular way of being in the world, and talked about their children. Joan had 2 daughters. One lived nearby and visited regularly. The other had moved to Singapore for work and called once a month, never long enough, but something. Joan missed her terribly, but accepted the distance as the price of her daughter's ambitions. Helen found herself telling Joan about the letters, about the silence, about not understanding what she'd done wrong or how to fix it. Joan listened without interrupting, the way good friends do. When Helen finished, Joan was quiet for a moment, stirring her tea with the kind of deliberate slowness that suggested she was choosing her words carefully. "Have you considered," said Joan finally, "that maybe it's not about you at all?" "What do you mean?" "Sometimes people need to separate from their parents, not because the parents did anything wrong, but because they need to figure out who they are independent of that relationship, especially daughters and mothers. There's so much entanglement there, so many expectations and histories and patterns." Helen absorbed this. "So you think Claire is trying to find herself?" I don't know Claire well enough to say, but I know that sometimes distance is about the person creating it, not the person receiving it. And trying to fix something that isn't actually broken, just changing, can make it worse. So I should stop writing the letters? I didn't say that, Joan smiled gently. I think the letters are lovely. They're your way of maintaining connection without demanding response. That's generous. But maybe you could also trust that Claire is doing what she needs to do, even if you don't understand it, even if it hurts. Helen thought about Joan's words through the quiet days between Christmas and New Year's, thought about them while she took down the decorations and packed them away for another year, thought about them while she prepared her Tuesday letter. Trust that Claire was doing what she needed to do. That was harder than it sounded, because trusting meant releasing control, releasing the narrative that Helen had somehow failed, releasing the hope that if she just said the right thing or did the right thing, Claire would come back. It meant accepting uncertainty, accepting that she might never know why Claire had withdrawn, accepting that the relationship might never return to what it had been. But it also meant releasing blame, both of Claire and of herself. It meant allowing for the possibility that this wasn't about fault at all, but about two people navigating their own paths in ways that sometimes diverged. Helen wasn't sure she believed that entirely, but she was willing to consider it. She wrote her Tuesday letter. Dear Claire, the new year is approaching. I've never been one for grand resolutions, but I find myself thinking about what I want the coming year to hold. More reading, certainly. More time in the garden. More patience with myself when things don't go as planned. I've been reflecting on our relationship, on this silence between us. I don't understand it fully, but I'm trying to trust that you have your reasons, that you're doing what you need to do, even if I can't see the full picture. I want you to know that I'm writing these letters not to pressure you or to guilt you into responding. I write them because you're my daughter and I love you, and this is how I know to show that. If receiving them causes you stress, please tell me and I'll stop. But if they're neutral, if they simply exist as a small gesture of ongoing connection, then I'll keep sending them. Whatever you need, sweetheart, I trust that you know what that is. Love, Mom. She mailed it and felt something shift. Not hope exactly, but a kind of release, a letting go of outcomes. January was always the hardest month. The decorations were down, the holidays were over, the days were short and gray and seemed to stretch on forever. This was when Robert's absence felt most acute, when the house felt most empty. Helen filled the time with routine, Tuesday letters, book club on Thursdays, volunteering at the hospital gift shop on Fridays, walks around the neighborhood when the weather permitted, small structures that kept the days from blurring into undifferentiated loneliness. She continued writing to Claire. Not every letter mentioned their estrangement, most didn't. She returned to the comfortable territory of observations and small stories. A funny thing that happened at book club, a recipe she tried, the first crocuses pushing up through frozen ground in late February, impossibly early but determinately hopeful. And still, Claire didn't respond. March arrived with its typical Seattle ambivalence, rain and occasional sun, cold mornings and surprisingly warm afternoons. Helen's garden began to wake up. The cherry tree budded, daffodils bloomed in cheerful yellow clusters. Helen was weeding the flower beds on a Saturday afternoon when a car pulled into her driveway. She looked up, squinting against the sun, and felt her heart stumble. Claire's car. Helen stood slowly, her knees protesting after too long crouched in the dirt. She brushed soil from her hands and waited, unsure what to do with the sudden surge of hope and fear coursing through her. Claire got out of the car. She looked tired, older than Helen remembered, though it had only been a few months since she'd last seen her. There were new lines around her eyes, new gray in her hair. They stood looking at each other across the driveway, 10 feet of space that felt like miles. "Hi, Mom," Claire said finally. "Hi, sweetheart." Another silence, not comfortable, but not hostile either. Searching. "Do you want to come inside? I'll make tea." Claire nodded. "That would be nice." They sat at the kitchen table, the same table where Helen had written 27 letters over the past 7 months. Claire held her teacup in both hands, not drinking, just holding it like she needed something to do with her hands. Helen waited. She'd learned over all these weeks of one-sided correspondence that sometimes the most powerful thing you could do was simply be present and let the other person find their words. "I've been reading your letters," Claire said finally. "All of them?" "Every one. Every Tuesday they arrive, and every Thursday I read them." She looked down into her tea. "I haven't known how to respond." "You don't have to respond." "I know, you said that in your last letter, but I wanted to. I just—" Claire stopped, started again. "I didn't know what to say, because responding felt like it would require explaining, and I wasn't ready to explain." "Explain what?" Claire was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was soft, almost fragile. "Why I needed space, why I pulled away, why I couldn't—" she paused, "why I couldn't be your daughter for a while." Helen felt something catch in her chest. "You're always my daughter." "I know, but I needed to figure out who I was outside of being your daughter, outside of all the expectations and histories and patterns we've built over 43 years. Claire looked up, meeting Helen's eyes. "Does that make sense?" "I think so." "I'm not blaming you," Claire continued quickly. "You were a good mother. You are a good mother. But somewhere along the way, I realized I'd built my entire identity around meeting expectations. Yours, Dad's, my husband's, my boss's. I was so busy being what everyone needed that I had no idea who I was underneath all that." Helen absorbed this. "And you needed distance to figure that out." "Yes, I needed to strip away all the voices telling me who to be and what to do, including yours, especially yours maybe, because your voice was the loudest. Not because you were overbearing," she added quickly, "but because I cared most about your opinion, your approval." "And now?" "Now I'm starting to know myself a little better, starting to trust my own judgment, starting to believe that I don't have to be perfect to be worthy of love." Claire smiled, small and sad. "It's harder than it sounds. It always is." They sat in silence for a moment. Helen could hear the clock ticking on the wall, the refrigerator humming, all the small sounds that filled empty space. "Your letters helped," Claire said. "I want you to know that. Even though I didn't respond, they helped. They were you loving me without demanding anything back, you giving me space while still showing up. That mattered more than you know." Helen felt tears prick her eyes. She blinked them back. "I'm glad. I'm sorry I didn't explain sooner. Sorry I let it go on so long without talking to you. You needed the time you needed. Maybe, but it must have hurt, not knowing, wondering what you'd done wrong." "It did hurt," Helen admitted, "but I survived it, and I think," she paused, choosing her words carefully, "I think maybe it taught me something too, about letting go, about trusting people to know what they need, about love being something you offer rather than something you demand." Claire's eyes filled with tears. "I love you, Mom." "I love you too, sweetheart." Claire didn't move back into Helen's life all at once. It wasn't a dramatic reunion, all forgiveness and tears and promises of constant connection. That wasn't how real healing worked. Instead, they started small. Claire came for tea the following Saturday. They talked about surface things, her boys, her work, Helen's garden, building comfort through ordinary conversation. The next week, Claire invited Helen to lunch. They went to a cafe halfway between their houses and shared a meal while discussing a book they'd both read. Neutral territory, safe topics. Gradually, over weeks and then months, they found a new rhythm. Not the same as before. That relationship was gone, and trying to recreate it would have been impossible. But something new, something that made space for Claire to be herself while still maintaining connection. Helen stopped writing the Tuesday letters. They weren't needed anymore. But she kept Robert's pen in the kitchen drawer, and sometimes she'd take it out and hold it, remembering all those weeks of faithful correspondence, remembering the discipline of showing up, the faith required to keep offering love without knowing if it would be received. May brought the cherry tree into full bloom. Helen stood in her backyard on a Saturday morning, looking up at the explosion of pink blossoms against blue sky, and felt something close to peace. Claire was coming for Mother's Day dinner tomorrow. She'd offered to bring dessert. Her sons might come too, though teenage boys were unpredictable, and Helen tried not to build expectations around their attendance. But Claire would be there. That was enough. More than enough. Helen thought about the past year, about the silence and the letters and the slow, painful process of learning to love without controlling, about Joan's wisdom that sometimes distance wasn't about fault, but necessary growth. Helen thought about all the things she'd wanted to say to Claire during those months of estrangement, all the explanations and defenses and pleas for understanding. How tempting it had been to demand answers, to insist on her right to know what she'd done wrong. But she hadn't done that. She'd trusted the process, trusted Claire, and somehow, impossibly, that trust had created space for Claire to return. Not because Helen had done everything right, but because she'd been willing to do the hardest thing of all, let go while still holding on, offer love without demanding proof it was received, show up week after week with nothing but faith that somewhere, somehow, it mattered. The Tuesday ritual had become habit now, even without the letters. Helen still sat at her kitchen table at 9 in the morning with her Earl Grey tea, but instead of writing, she simply sat, noticed, observed the world through her west-facing window. This particular Tuesday in early June, she watched a pair of sparrows building a nest in her cherry tree. They worked with remarkable dedication, flying back and forth with twigs and bits of string, gradually constructing something that would hold their family. Helen thought about nests, about the patient work of building structures that could hold what mattered, and about how sometimes those structures needed to be taken apart and rebuilt differently to accommodate growth. She thought about Claire, who was slowly rebuilding her sense of self, about her grandsons who were becoming young men with their own complicated relationships to family and identity, about her sons who lived far away but called more frequently now, perhaps sensing their mother's vulnerability in ways they hadn't before. She thought about Robert, who'd been gone 5 years now, but whose wisdom still guided her, who'd taught her, through example, that love was patient and kind and willing to wait for understanding rather than demanding it immediately. And she thought about herself, about the woman she'd been before this estrangement and the woman she was becoming because of it. How loss and silence and uncertainty had taught her things she couldn't have learned any other way. How the hardest lessons were often the most valuable. Mother's Day dinner was simple. Helen made pot roast, Claire's childhood favorite. Claire brought a lemon cake she'd baked from scratch. The boys came after all, polite but distracted, typical teenagers, more interested in their phones than conversation. But they were there, all of them, sitting around Helen's old oak table with its scars and water rings and history, passing dishes, making small talk, being family in all its imperfect, complicated glory. After dinner, while the boys were loading the dishwasher and Claire's husband was checking sports scores on his phone, Helen and Claire stood together on the back porch looking at the cherry tree. "It's beautiful this year," Claire said. "It always is. Your father planted it well." "I remember when it was just a stick in the ground. Hard to believe it grew into this." "Things grow when you give them time and space and the right conditions." Claire glanced at her mother. "Are we still talking about the tree?" Helen smiled. "Maybe not entirely." They stood in comfortable silence, the kind of silence that felt full rather than empty, connected rather than severed. "Thank you," Claire said finally, "for the letters, for not giving up, for loving me even when I wasn't capable of receiving it very well." "You don't have to thank me for loving you. That's not something you earn. That's just what mothers do." "Not all mothers." "No," Helen agreed, "not all mothers. But I do, and I will. No matter how much space you need or how much distance you require, that doesn't change." Claire's eyes filled with tears. "I know. I'm starting to really know that now, not just intellectually, but here," she touched her chest, "here, where it matters." "Good. That's good, sweetheart." Inside, they could hear the boys arguing about whose turn it was to dry dishes. The dishwasher door slammed. Someone laughed. The ordinary sounds of family life continuing in its messy, beautiful way. "Should we go rescue them?" Claire asked. "Probably." But neither of them moved yet. They stood together in the fading light, watching the cherry blossoms drift down like pink snow, and Helen felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Not happiness exactly, but something deeper, more durable. She felt grateful for the silence that had taught her patience, for the letters that had kept connection alive, for the long, slow process of learning to love better, to love more wisely, to love without needing to control how that love was received. She had learned, somewhere between 70 and 82, that silence could be the loudest form of love. But she was learning now, at 82, that silence broken by understanding was even louder, was in fact the sound of healing, the sound of growth, the sound of family finding its way back to itself through patience and faith and the persistent, quiet belief that love, real love, could survive anything, even silence, even distance, even the painful process of becoming yourself. The sparrows continued building their nest in the cherry tree, back and forth, twig by twig, creating something that would hold what mattered most. Helen watched them and smiled. She understood exactly how they felt.